Bonsoir. Welcome to the newcomers and welcome back for the others. Sorry, that was quite a long pause, but well, with everyone back to school and all the stuff that you have to deal in September, well, I didn't get really lots of time. But here we go for chapter 16 of the book 6 of Ranger Apprentice, always written by John Flanagan. Here we go. The plan for the ambush was simple. Will had selected a spot close to their temporary campsite where the track ran in a relatively long straight stretch. Gundar and 9 of his Candians would be concealed in the trees to either side. They would be at the beginning of the straight section so that, once the Scotty had passed by them, the sea wolves would be able to surprise them from behind. Will and Horace will take a position at the far end, where they could draw the enemy's attention. The idea was that Will and Horace would step into sight and call upon the Scotty to halt. Then, while their attention was diverted, the Scandians would quickly emerge from the trees behind the invaders, who would realize they were outnumbered and surrounded, and that resistance was futile. The 2 young men had yet to figure what they would do with the 9 captives when they were secured. Somehow, they would have to keep them prisoner, but Will decided to face that problem later. He knew, from his own experience and from watching and listening to Halt, that the mere appearance of a ranger was often enough to stop enemies in their tracks. In extreme cases, parties larger than this one had surrendered without a fight. Will didn't expect that to happen, but he thought that the sight of a ranger would at the very least cause the Scotty party to hesitate. And that moment of uncertainty will give the Scandians the opportunity to move in and disarm them. Will made it to the tree line, well in advance of the Scotty. One of the Scandians was posted there, as he had instructed. The man leaped to his feet in alarm as a ranger suddenly seemed to materialize out of the twilight, right in front of him. He grabbed for the axe leaning against the tree beside him, but fortunately, Will stopped him in time. "Relax," he said, throwing back the cowl of his cloak so that the sentry could see his face. "It's only me." "Gorlog's bird ranger," the Scandian said, shaking his head. "You startled the hell out of me." Gorlog was a lesser Scandian deity who had a long beard, curved horns, and fang-like teeth. On different occasions, Will had heard all of those features invoked by startled Scandians. But he didn't waste time discussing the issue now. "They're on their way," he said briefly. "Let's go." The Scandian looked back across the open ground to the castle. Dimly, he could make out a small group of men moving towards them. He turned back to the ranger, but Will was already running down the track to the ambush site. Hastily, the Scandians followed in his tracks. Like Horace, he was intrigued by the way the cloaked figure seemed to shimmer in and out of sight as he moved. He blundered along the narrow track in pursuit of the elusive shape ahead of him. Horace was waiting at the turn in the track that marked the beginning of the straight stretch. He also started in alarm as Will suddenly seemed to rise out of the ground beside him. "Don't do that," he said angrily. Then, As he saw Will's puzzled expression, he explained, "You know we don't hear you coming, and we can hardly see you. Make some sort of noise so we know you're there." "Sorry," Will said. "The Scotty are on their way." Horace nodded, his momentary annoyance forgotten. He turned towards the trees. "Gundor, did you hear that? They're coming." There was a rustle of movement in the trees, and Will saw the shadowy figures of the Scandians moving into position. They had been relaxing in the cleared campsite. Now they moved closer to the track itself. Will nodded approvingly as he saw that. On Horace's instructions, they had taken off their indistinctive horned helmets. Nothing will give the ambush away faster than the sight of massive ox horns nodding among the bushes. Gundor stepped out of the trees with 4 of his men. The other 5 found positions a few meters back from the track and settled down to wait. "All right, Horace," Gundor said. "We hear you. How long before they're here?" Horace glanced inquiringly at Will, who answered for him. "Maybe 10 minutes. Get into position. And once you're there, don't keep moving around." He searched for a way to emphasize the order, then said, "By Gorlok's fang and bird, all right?" Gundor grinned at him. "Nice to see you learning the language," he said. "Don't worry, we've ambushed people before." He gestured for the 4 men with him to move to the opposite side of the track, thus putting 5 men on either side. Before he plunged into the bushes, he called softly to the others. "Anyone make a noise, I crack his skull, all right?" There was a muttered chorus of understanding. Then the burly Scandians sank slowly out of sight, behind bushes and trees. "Remember," Will said, "we want this man alive. He'll be the one in the lead. He has half his face painted in blue stripes." "How attractive," Horace murmured. Will glared at him. "And a large broadsword slung over his shoulder," he added. Horace made a small moue of mock concern. "Not so attractive," he said. Will ignored him. Gundor rose out of the bushes beside the truck, rather like a wall surfacing. "So, we take this blue face alive," he said, but won't be broken-hearted if some of his men don't survive." "I'd prefer avoid bloodshed," Will said, but he knew in a situation like this, things rarely went exactly to plan. "Do what you can," he said. "Wait till you hear me call on them to stop. Give it a moment or so until I've got their attentions. Then move in behind them. If we time it right, they shall surrender without a fight." He said the last to reassure himself more than anything else. Gundor's expression left no doubt that he wasn't convinced. "That's a maybe," he said skeptically. "But if they even look like fighting, my boys will start hitting." Will nodded. He couldn't ask for more than that. In a situation like this, he wouldn't expect the Scandians to take unnecessary risk just because it preferred to avoid bloodshed. "Fair enough," he told the squirrel. "Now get back into cover before they're here." Gundor sank back into the undergrowth and, once more, Will was reminded of a well surfacing them, submerging. But he didn't have time to ponder the matter. Horace plucked at his sleeve. "Let's go," he said briefly, and led the way to the far end of the track. Horace stepped off into the trees, a few paces to get out of sight. Will simply remained by the side of the track, his skull pulled up over his head, and the cloak pulled around him. He held his bow in his left hand with a pair of arrows ready between the fingers of his right hand. He glanced into the undergrowth and noticed that Horace had covered his white enameled shield with dull green clothes. He nodded approvingly. In the rapidly failing light, there had been no gleam of white to warn the Scotty. He tensed suddenly as he heard them coming. There was a dull shuffle of jogging feet on the thick, dry snow cover. Horace saw his involuntarily movement. "Are they here?" he said softly. "Any moment. Keep quiet," Will warned him. He slipped the cowl back slightly so he could hear more clearly. Now he could just make out the soft, squeaking sound of boots against the dry snow. He stood stock, still beside a large tree trunk, eyes intent on the dark aperture among the trees that marked the bend in the track 20 meters away. A figure appeared, indistinct and blurred, at first in the falling snow and dull light. It soon could be recognized as the Scottish general, Mac Haddish. His men followed close behind him, in 4 pairs. Will waited until they were all clear of the corner, then stepped out in the center of the track, knocking an arrow and bringing the bow up at half throw. "King's Ranger," he shouted, in case there were any doubts in their minds. "Stand where you are." There was a moment of shocked surprise among the Scotty as a strange figure suddenly became visible in front of them. MacHaddish heard the shouted comment, but made no sense of it. The word "King's Ranger" meant nothing to him. Will might as well have shouted "King's Rabbits." The truth was, Will's excellent plan would have worked perfectly, if only the Scotty had understood their part in it all. In Araluen, the mere presence of a ranger would be often enough to settle a matter like this without fighting. Unfortunately, the Scotty, in their remote northern country, had been involved in very few dealings with rangers, and so were in no awe of them. They were taken off guard by Will's sudden appearance, and for a moment they froze. Will saw that initial hesitation among the Scotty and relaxed a little, smiling to himself as he thanked the generations of past rangers who had built such a remarkable reputation. Then everything went very wrong. MacHaddish recovered from his moment of surprise. His right hand reached back over his shoulder and closed on the massive hilt of his broadsword, sliding it free of its scabbard in a movement so smooth and rapid that it had to have been rehearsed hundreds of times in the past. "Nasharis Nambar!" he screamed, brandishing the huge blade aloft, circling it in the air. His men, galvanized into action, echoed the words, the war cry of the MacHaddish clan. The scream rose from 8 throats, and MacHaddish hurled himself forward at the indistinct figure on the track ahead of him. 2 of his men followed close behind as he charged. The other turned to face Gendar and his Scandins as they crashed from the undergrowth, axes wheeling. Will, faced with an armed and seemingly enraged Scotty general, brought the boat to full draw instinctively. At the last moment, he remembered his own instructions to the Scandins, and, just before he released, moved the aim point from the center of the general's chest to his right wrist. The arrow seared through the tendons and nerves in the wrist, the immediate shock of the wound depriving the hand of all feeling, numbing the entire arm and robbing MacHaddish of the strength to brandish the huge sword. With a startled cry of pain, he doubled over, letting the broadsword fall to the track as he clutches his right wrist with his left hand. But Will had no further time for MacHaddish. The other two Scotty were almost upon him. He knocked and fired his second arrow in one movement, dropping one of them to the snow, dead in his tracks. Then the other was all over him, screaming hate and revenge, sword going back for a killing stroke. Will hurled himself to the side, hitting the deep snow on his shoulder and rolling, discarding the bow as he went, his right hand drawing the sax knife as he rolled to his feet again. But the Scotty's blow had been intercepted by Horace's shield. The blade snagged and tore a huge gash in the cloth cover. The Scotty took Horace's sword on his own small shield as Horace struck at him in reply. But he was in no way prepared for the Araluan knight's blinding follow-up speed. Even as the Scotty prepared to strike back, he realized that he was already behind the rhythm of the fight, and the taller man's sword was slashing around at him again. He blocked desperately with the shield, grunting at the force of the blow jarred his arm. Then, unbelievably, another stroke was on its way from yet another angle, and he had to parry quickly with his sword. He felt as if he were fighting two men, felt the gut-freezing terror of impending death as the sword was jarred from his grip and went spinning into the trees. Blindly, he stooped to reach for the dirk in the top of his boot, but as he did so, Horace planted his own sword point first in the ground and stepped forward to throw a solid right uppercut to his jaw. The Scotty's eye rolled up in his head, and his knees collapsed under him. He went face down in the soft snow, unconscious. At the far end of the track, Will and Horace became aware of shouts and of the clash of weapons. The Scotty were severely outflanked and outnumbered, with 6 men facing 10, but they continued to fight, wounding 2 of the Scandins. That was probably a mistake, as it goaded Gundar into a fighting rage. His axe wheeled around his head, and he carved a path through his clansmen, smashing aside the inadequate hand shields that they carried. There were only 2 left standing by the time they opted to lower their weapons and call for mercy. Gundar, blind and deaf with fighting rage, didn't hear them, but one of the Scandins threw his arms around his skull and dragged him away to calm down. The other Scandins surged around for the surviving clansmen, knocking the weapons out of their hand and forcing them to their knees. Horace and Will exchanged a look, shaking their heads. "Well," said Horace, "that wasn't quite the way we planned it." Will was grateful that he had said "we" and not "you." He reshedded his sax knife. "Not quite," he said, "but at least we've got Makadish." He looked around to the spot where the general had sunk to his knees, cradling his wounded right arm. There was a large red stain on the snow, but no sign of Makadish. That's all for chapter 16. That was quite a lot of actions. Hope it will be calmer on the next one, because action is hard to do. See you later.